Thank you for joining us for another amazing semester of the seminar series. Judd, take it away.
Excellent. All right, so let me share my screen, make sure you all can see it. Beautiful. All right, well, thank you to Katie and to Angela for inviting me. Very excited to be kicking off this series. Thank you to Dean for stepping in as a host today. This paper is The Gender Gap in Self-Promotion. It's joint work with the excellent Christine Exley, who's at Harvard Business School. As Katie mentioned, it's about gender gaps in pay and labor market outcomes. And this is a topic that many people have studied and looked at a bunch of factors that drive these disturbing gender gaps. So factors that have been observed and studied using observational data include differences between men and women in educational outcomes, experience in the labor market, and occupational choice as well. There's also a bunch of mostly experimental work that's looked at other factors that might drive gender gaps in pay and labor market outcomes. And these include differences between men and women in interest in competition, in risk aversion, in desire to negotiate and success when negotiating, and confidence, or how well I think that I do on an objective task. So we're going to add to this literature. We're going to be looking at what I'll define shortly, self-promotion, and what the underlying drivers of any gender gap in self-promotion might be. So what is self-promotion and why should we study it? So when I talk about self-promotion, I'm thinking about first how I evaluate my own performance or ability, and then the promotion bit is how I communicate that to others who might influence my subsequent labor market outcomes. So I think one of the reasons we should study self-promotion is that it's quite common. So when you think about applying for a job or applying to an education program like college or professional school, you're often asked explicitly or implicitly to talk about your performance and ability. Once you're in a job, your performance reviews might specifically ask you to talk about how well you did, last year or in this role. And just in general, how we communicate when you're talking to people at work or people who might have influence over your career, are you communicating in a way that makes your performance and ability seem strong or seem weak? So one of the additional reasons I think we should study self-promotion, or one of the reasons I think it hasn't really been covered by a bunch of prior work, is that it's different than lots of the things that we study. It's a setting where there's not quite an objective truth. When we are thinking about self-promotion, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, right? If somebody asks you, come out of a meeting and somebody says, how'd you do? You could say you did terrible, you could say you did okay, you could say you did excellent. There's no obvious right answer to that. Similarly, if you get asked in an interview, are you a proficient computer coder? It depends on what you mean by the word proficient. Similarly with team player, you can think of all the settings where the specific word choice might make it hard to be to have there be an obvious right answer. So one of the challenges and one of the reasons why we're going to be doing this in an experimental setting is that measuring self-promotion is difficult, as is comparing it across groups of people. Okay, so what we're going to be doing in the study today is running an experiment that allows us to quantify self-promotion and then compare equally performing men and women on a well-defined task. So in particular, I'll talk to you about our self-promotion version, but then I'm going to spend a bunch of time thinking through a bunch of different possible mechanisms for the gender gap that we observe. And one of them will be, is it due to the promotion aspect per se, or is it about the self-evaluations more generally? Does it matter that if there's a gender gap, which there will be, that it's about me promoting myself, or is it just how I see myself, my self-evaluation? All right, so let's jump in. Let me tell you about the design. Almost all of the study versions I'll tell you about follow exactly this procedure. Subjects first, they take a test where they answer 20 questions from the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. This is a bunch of math and science questions. It's used to measure cognitive ability. And so subjects will see 4 questions from 5 different categories: assembling objects, arithmetic, math, mechanical engineering, and science. They're incentivized on this test to answer questions correctly. Every question they get correct, they'll earn an additional 5 cents. Okay, so to give you a sense of what these are math and science questions, to give you a sense at least of assembling objects, here's a question. Subjects have 30 seconds to answer each question, and there's no penalty for guessing. For those following along at home, the second option is the correct one here. So subjects will take these this test, 20 questions. Then we ask them, how well do you think you did? Out of the 20 questions, how many do you think you got correct? We do not incentivize that, but I'll show you data from that shortly. Then we ask 4 self-evaluation questions. These are the questions that we're going to be looking at throughout the remainder of the talk, and really sort of trying to get a sense of what, whether there's a gender gap in. Okay, so what do these look like? Well, there's one that I'll focus on. I'll show you all the graphs that I show you today. We'll be analyzing this question. It's a continuous measure from 0 to 100. This is how we're quantifying. Subjects are asked on a scale from 0, entirely disagree, to 100, entirely agree. Please indicate the extent to which you agree with the statement, I performed well on the test I took. All right, so we're going to have for each subject between 0 and 100 their level of agreement with this question. Now, this is one of the 4. We also have a discrete measure where subjects are asked to pick one of 6 adjectives to describe their performance on the test. And then we have 2 other continuous measures that don't ask just about past performance on the test, but also about how subjects think that performance would translate. We ask them their agreement with their willingness to apply for a job that required them to perform well, and succeeding in a job that required them to perform well. So how do we make these self-evaluation questions? How do we turn them into self-promotion? Well, the self-evaluations are anonymous, but they're incentivized. So what subjects are told in the main self-promotion version is that one of the answers to one of these questions will be given to an employer who will use that answer and that answer alone to determine whether to hire the worker and how much to pay them. Okay, so subjects know that these questions matter, and self-promotion pays. So workers earn more when they give higher answers to these questions. All right, what do we find? So I'm going to tell you about data we collected from 4,000 participants. These are from MTurk and Prolific. They have to meet certain standards, and they do a 20-minute study. The data comes from one of 7 versions that we collected in 5 waves. Okay, so I just want to briefly show you this, and because I'm going to be picking and choosing from this data as we go through the talk. So the first wave, we did the self-promotion version I just described, and 2 other versions. And then in each of the next 4 waves, we replicated at least one of the prior treatments, and then introduced a new treatment to extend our understanding of the gender gaps that we saw. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about data from these different waves. The first 4 were collected on Mechanical Turk. The last one was collected on Prolific. But I just want to emphasize that in each of these waves, we replicate at least one of the treatments. And this is not about p-hacking. Any significant gender gaps that we get, we're going to get in one of the cells. We'll get them in each of the subsequent cells. All right, so what do we find? Let me show you raw differences from the self-promotion treatment, and then we'll unpack them. Okay, so you've just taken the test of 20 questions. We asked you, how well you think you did, and then we asked you these self-promotion questions. This is the agreement with I performed well on this test from 0 to 100. Men on average report agreement level of 61. Okay, and this is substantially and significantly higher than what women report, which is 46. All right, so we're seeing, the distribution looks different. I'll show you CDF in a second, but men are reporting substantially higher agreement with having done well on this test. Here's the CDF. The black line is women. The blue dashed line is men. Okay, and it's not quite first order stochastic dominance, but close, that men are reporting more positive self-evaluations in the self-promotion treatment. So this is the gender gap in self-promotion. Your first question, I should point out, I showed you just one of the 4 measures. It's similarly sized for all 4. Your first question might be, is this just driven by performance differences on this task? So, it could be that I picked a task where men perform better, and then they say they perform, better, and that makes sense. So I'm going to show you performance by gender, and then I'm going to show you results, regression results, that include performance fixed effects. So I'm comparing equally performing men and women, say people who both answer 10 of the 20 questions correctly. I'll be able to control for that when I look at their self-evaluations. Well, turns out there's no performance gap on this test. Men and women on average each answer 10 questions correctly. Okay, you can see that in the CDFs as well. All right, so it's going to be the case, as I'll show it here, that, this is for all 4 measures, that when we include fixed effects, performance fixed effects, there's still a very large and significant gap in self-promotion. So I'll show you a bunch of tables that look like this. These are the 4 different self-evaluation questions, and negative and significant coefficients are going to be evidence of a gap. And in red, I show the percentage effect of the average self-evaluation. So what we're seeing here is that about 20 to 30%, women are reporting self-evaluations that are about 20 to 30% lower than the average evaluation on these 4 measures. So we're observing a gender gap in self-promotion among equally performing men and women. And the next question is this just driven by differences in performance beliefs? Okay, and when I say performance beliefs, this is what the literature, prior literature typically calls confidence. All right, so if men and women both answered 10, but men think they answered more, maybe then the self-promotion is just reflective of those beliefs. Okay, so I'm going to show you beliefs by gender, and then I'm going to show you how we control for beliefs to see the extent to which belief differences are driving this gender gap in self-promotion. Right? So this is a setting where maybe unsurprisingly, men are over-optimistic about their performance. So remember, men on average answer 10 questions correctly. Men on average think they answered 11 questions correctly. Women, on the other hand, are under-optimistic. So they think that they answered 8 questions correctly, even though on average they answered 10 questions correctly. Here's the CDF where I've subtracted off the actual performance. And so if you're to the right of the red line, that means you are overestimating your performance. And if you're to the left, you're underestimating. And you can see, from this, men, the dashed blue line, right, more men are overestimating their performance than underestimating. More women are underestimating their performance than overestimating. All right, so this is definitely a setting where we see belief differences, and that's consistent with what we've observed in prior literature. So can we close the gender gap in this self-promotion and these self-evaluations by fixing the differences in beliefs? Right? Is the gender gap in self-promotion driven by this belief difference? So I'm not going to get into this because it's a short talk, but in the paper we have a long discussion about why we use experimental design intervention to control this gap in beliefs. We think there's issues with using the beliefs to control statistically for beliefs, which we could do, and we show why we think it's problematic in the paper. Okay, but we're going to eliminate the role of both absolute and relative performance beliefs by design. Okay, so this is how we're going to do it. So I've already talked you through the first 3 parts of the experiment. Take the test, give your beliefs, give your self-evaluations. The full design has 2 additional stages. After the first round of self-evaluations, subjects are told specifically information on their past performance, on how many questions they answer correctly on the test, as well as relative information, how that compares to other subjects in the study. Then they answer the same 4 self-evaluation questions, but now they know how well they actually performed. So what does this information that they get look like? Well, if they answered 15 questions correctly, they'll be told you answered 15 questions correctly on the test. That's the absolute performance information. The relative performance information will look like your score on the test was better than 80% and worse than 12% of prior participants. Okay, so I want to emphasize that once I've told 2 equally performing men and women exactly how well they performed, right, both in absolute and relative terms, if they have a difference in their self-promotion, and if they have difference in their self-evaluations, it no longer can be driven by differences in their beliefs about how well they did, because we've pinned those down. They both answered the same number of questions, and they both know exactly how many questions they answered. So it turns out this information does not have much of an impact on men or on women. Okay, so men's average ratings go down just a tiny bit, women's go up just a tiny bit, but there's still a very large and significant gap between men and women once we've ruled out the possibility that it's driven by differences in beliefs. Right, so this is the coefficient estimates and the percentages once individuals are informed about their performance and are providing these self-evaluations. You may notice the coefficients and the percentages are slightly smaller than they were before, right? Still large and significant. It turns out that in the data I've just shown you, the sort of slight shrinking of the gender gap is not statistically significant, but it turns out if you take all of our data where we ask uninformed and informed self-evaluations on these questions, you do get a significant mitigation of the gender gap that we observed. Here's the interaction informed times female. When this is positive, that means the gender gap, which is here, is getting somewhat smaller. Notice, however, that this interaction term is substantially smaller than the main gender gap, which means that while we're shrinking the gender gap a little bit, it's still quite significant. So where are we? We've shown this very large gap in self-promotion. When we fix beliefs, it goes from being a very large gap to being a large gap. And now we're going to see what else we can do to try to shrink it. So I promised that when we were thinking about why we might see a gender gap in self-promotion, that I would look at whether it was the promotion aspect per se, or whether there was maybe something deeper in the way that men and women evaluate themselves. So how are we going to remove promotion incentives? Well, we're just going to do a version that we call the private version, where we remove employers. Okay, so once we remove employers, now you're providing answers to these self-evaluation questions. You're getting a fixed bonus payment for it, and you no longer have any incentive to, say, strategically distort your self-evaluations, to earn more money. You no longer have to worry about what employers will think when you say, that you agree 70% that you did well on the test. And so there's a bunch of channels that you could imagine a gender difference arising because of the presence of employers. Once we remove employers and you're giving self-evaluations without them being communicated to the employers, we eliminate the possible role that gender differences in these factors might be contributing to the gender gap we observe. So what happens in a version where there's no employers, where you're asked the same 4 questions, but they're not communicated? Well, men decrease their self-evaluations. So in fact, men were inflating their self-evaluations to look favorable to employers. But it turns out that women were doing the same thing. So in fact, both men and women, when it's in the private version, give lower self-evaluation scores than they did in the self-promotion version, right? But because they both decrease by a similar amount, the gap in the gender gap in self-evaluations remains large and significant. Okay, so this is for uninformed, and again, the same thing is true with informed evaluations. So again, this is just regressions to show that the incentives to promote matter. People give higher self-evaluation scores when they know they're going to be communicated, but they're not driving the gender gap in self-promotion. Right, and so the way that we say this is that the gender gap in self-promotion is reflective of gender gaps in self-evaluation that arise even absent employers. Okay, so if the gender gap is sort of coming from the self-evaluations, what is driving that? What is driving this deeper gap in how I talk about my own performance on this math and science task? So, tell you about some other interventions that we use to try to eliminate the gender gap in self-evaluation. First one was, we wondered whether men and women had different perceptions about what was the appropriate way to talk about past performance. So to address this, we did a version where we gave information on typical self-evaluations to men and women. We call this the private social norms version. We have them do the uninformed self-evaluations. And then when we provide the information about how many questions they answered correctly and how that, the relative performance, how that compared to others, when we were eliciting their informed self-evaluations, we also gave them information on what other people who scored the same amount on the test, what the average evaluation was that those folks gave. Okay, so here you can see one of the main question that I've been talking about. I performed well in the test I took. And in this treatment, we tell them, participants who scored the same as you on the test, the average score was 38. Right, so if differences in between men and women and what beliefs about what's appropriate are driving the gap, this should mitigate it. It turns out it doesn't. So informed self-evaluations, the gap is just as large and just as significant when subjects have this information. Okay, next thing that we wondered whether so if you think about experiments, you might be worried about this, that in all the versions I've talked about thus far, we always ask subjects to provide uninformed evaluations followed by informed evaluations. So maybe you might worry that while we're fully informing people about their performance, absolute and relative, when we ask for informed self-evaluations, you might worry that they've already answered the uninformed evaluations and now they're anchoring to those responses, and so that's why the gap persists. Now, Christine and I were a little torn here because we think often in practice you're developing evaluations of yourself and how well you did before you get to actually see your performance. You come out of a test and you think how did I do before you actually see your grade. That being said, we don't want our effect that we observe to be an artifact of having asked and then asked again. So what we do to address consistency and anchoring effects is we do a version that we call the immediately informed version, where we just eliminate the uninformed self-evaluations. So instead, you take the test, then you are asked, then you're told immediately how well you did, and then you are asked the informed self-evaluation questions, and we don't have the uninformed. What we find here is that with this reduction of consistency motives, we still get the same effects, large and significant gender gap in self-evaluations. Okay, so it's not about having asked them twice. If we just tell them immediately how well they did, we get the same gaps. So we're still, we've thrown the kitchen sink at this, so to speak, and we still are getting a big gender gap. So we decide, we want to do a few more treatments to really see, what's driving this. One thing you might, ask at this point is, well, maybe men and women just have different perceptions of what good performance is. Maybe men and women, just use the scale differently. They disagree about, about what a 12 on the test actually means. So to get at this, we have a version where subjects are asked about others, so asked to evaluate others' performance instead of themselves. So what we do is it's just like the version where you're immediately informed that I just described, but instead of in this other evaluation version, instead of being immediately informed about your own performance, you're immediately informed about somebody else's performance. You take the test, then you say, can you evaluate somebody who answered, and then we'll say 12 questions correctly on the test. Right, then they're asked to provide answer the same 4 questions. Unbeknownst to the subjects, when they're asked to answer about somebody who scored 12 questions correctly on the test, we're asking them about somebody who had the same score as the subject did. So if the subject answered 12 questions correctly, they're not told that, but they're asked to evaluate somebody that also scored 12 questions correctly. This allows us to have the most natural comparison to our existing data. What happens when subjects are asked to evaluate others instead of themselves? Well, now we see no gender gap in evaluations. All right, and this is true for all 4 of our measures, although there's small and significant effects for the apply and succeed, right? But they're all dramatically smaller and statistically significantly smaller gaps than when subjects are evaluating themselves. Right, so the first indication that this is something about the way that I evaluate myself and not how I think about performance in general comes from this asked about others treatment. Finally, we have a version where this was sort of thanks to comments from people that when we gave this talk previously, we got asked to look at a female type task. Now, for those who are not familiar with this kind of language, the math and science questions that we've asked in the prior versions, that's typically considered a male type task. The expectation among subjects is that men are going to do better than women. And in fact, the beliefs, men believe men are overconfident, women are underconfident. That's typical of a male type task. We wanted to see if this gap was similar or different in a setting where the task was quote unquote female typed. So what we did for that is we did the private verbal version. So here subjects are asked 20 questions, but instead of the math and science questions, they're asked word knowledge questions. This is an example of those questions. And the only other difference is that subjects had 15 seconds instead of 30, basically so that they wouldn't have time to go Google what sacrosanct meant. Right? Once subjects are asked verbal questions, we no longer see gender gap in self-evaluations. This is true for the 4 uninformed evaluations and also when subjects are informed. Right, the gender gap is gone in verbal questions. It doesn't reverse. Okay, it's not that women say that they're doing better, but at least it goes away. Right, so we see no gap in the female type task. I don't have much time, but I do want to mention this data that we got on what I'm calling origins, in part because Angela was instrumental in getting us this data. This is data from her Character Lab research network. We basically ran close to 12,000 youth through a simplified version of our main ASVAB version. They have 10 questions instead of 20. They're much easier because the kids are younger. And we asked them about likelihood of taking and succeeding in a related class rather than a related job. We have a lot of spread in grades, but mostly the kids are in middle school, although a good number are in high school. And what we see in both uninformed and informed self-evaluations is that there is a gender gap in this data from these youth in all 4 of our questions, both uninformed and informed. This was the data I was most interested in seeing. This is those 4 measures and the coefficient on the gender gap for each of the grades in our data. And so, if you look at the middle school data, in particular, the younger grades, we see a gender gap in self-evaluations even as early as 6th grade. That's as early as our data comes, both for uninformed evaluations and for informed evaluations. So I took this to mean, this is something that is developing early, and it might be like all the other ways that we tried to get rid of it. It might be particularly sticky. So briefly to conclude, what have we learned? We've learned there's gender gaps in self-evaluations. They're robust. They're difficult to eliminate. They arise early in life. Every time we did the math and science questions on MCIRC and Prolific, every one of the questions in every wave, we get statistically significant gender gaps. It persists with all of the things that we've thrown at it. I won't go over them again because we just talked through them. And the gap appears as early as middle school. The gaps are also large. We're getting gaps that are 20, 25, 30% of the average self-evaluations. We know that the gender gap, at least in our setting, the gender gap in self-promotion reflects an underlying gender gap in self-evaluation. We know that gap is specific to own performance. It doesn't appear when we're looking at performance of others. It arises for a male type task, but not a female type task, which may mean that it's reflecting deeper self-perceptions, right? If men and women, think differently about how good they are at math and science in general, then when this specific task comes along, and even though I know how well I did, and I got the same score as a equally performing man, right? If that deeper self-perception works its way into my self-evaluations of that performance on that test, right? That's going to generate a gender gap, particularly for these male type tasks. Such self-perceptions may be learned at a young age, as we see the effect in 6th grade. This is my last slide, and I feel like this is the kind of thing we could talk about at length in the Q&A, right? But what's the solution to this? We see kind of 2 approaches: a change the people approach, where we encourage women to give better self-evaluations and do more promotion, or encourage men to give worse ones, or change the system approaches, where we try to develop ways of evaluating people without self-evaluations and relying more on objective measures. Christine and I are more in the second camp, both because it's really hard in our data to eliminate these gender gaps, so the first one might not work, and also because it seems unfair to ask individuals to change the way that they think about themselves as kind of a solution to a social problem. So with that, I will stop and open it up to questions.
Great. Thanks, Judd. So I'm going to start with one of the questions that you actually touched on the answer on, but I think it's a particularly hairy question. So I would love to hear your answer. It came from Ross O'Hara, but I'm going to amend it based on what you said subsequent to the posting. Do you think you'd find a similar self-promotion gap if you used cognitive tests that didn't carry agenda stigma, math engineering with it already? So your answer clearly is yes, you found a different one. So my kind of addendum to this question is, why in your conclusion you don't seem quite as enthusiastic about this being like the explanation, and so I'm struck by why are you why are you not seeing this as the answer, and then trying to understand what is it about the perception and what's driving this stigma?
Yeah, so that's great. So I mean, I think one of the reasons why we focused on the math and science questions as the primary task throughout the study, was that, the performance in math and science and STEM in general, we think that that is sort of gender gaps there are one of the main contributing factors to the gender gaps, in occupational choice and potentially in pay as well. So that was our initial, why we focused on that initially. It's reassuring, I would say, that it and helps speak to the mechanisms that the gap goes away in a verbal task that's more female typed. Could a solution be, make the world such that math and science are not are not male typed, but are kind of neutral? That, I think that would be great. I think that's that is kind of a change the system approach. But it feels like a big lift. So if we're thinking about at a firm level or at a school level, how can we correct the potential damage that a gender gap in self-evaluation or self-promotion does? I think kind of changes that rely more on thinking about objective performance rather than asking people to talk to us about how well they did might be helpful. I think you're still muted.
You're on mute.
I'm muted. I'm sorry. I'm being bad at this job. My next question that I must ask. Do you think women may undervalue being in the top 20% or, some arbitrary number? So the key here is really just, what is it that defines self-promotion? And is there a different, maybe the propensity for self-promotion isn't different, but just the threshold at which one is comfortable self-promoting is different. So what can you say?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, I think the data that we have that speaks most closely to this is, we can look at different points in the performance distribution and see the gender gap, in each sort of bucket of performance. Now, we always ask people about, self-evaluation questions conditional on their own performance. So I'm not separately identifying, high achievers from high performers. But what I can say is that we see the gender gap in self-evaluations, and you could probably see this from the CDFs that I showed, sort of there throughout the whole distribution. Christine and I have slight disagreements. If you cut the data a third, it looks maybe a little bit bigger in the middle third, but it's there for all of them. And, I don't think we can say anything conclusive about, the gender gap in self-evaluations differing in the performance distribution. But I think we are confident that it's not just coming from one small subset. This is not just about people at the margin of, being in the top 20% or something who are reacting differently. It's something that's across the whole gamut.
Do you also have variation in who's evaluating them, and is that driving the self-promotion decision?
So this is a great question. So this is there's a whole set of questions that relate to who is receiving the evaluations and what the workers know when they're making the evaluations about who's going to see them. So I think one of the reasons, I'm motivated with self-promotion, but then, a lot of the treatments that I showed you were looking in the self-evaluation space where there's no employers. They're different private versions. One of the things about being in those versions is that it's never communicated to anybody. So all those results are independent of the communication. That being said, there's this question of, will my self-promotion look different if I know that I'm talking to somebody who's the same gender as me? Or do I think that people might react to men and women promoting differently? So that latter concern is called backlash. And one might worry that there's more backlash against women who self-promote than against men who self-promote. And so I think that's actually one of the reasons why we don't love the change the people approach, because giving advice, women, you should self-promote more, when we don't actually know. Maybe that's terrible advice. Maybe if they self-promote more, people will display backlash and punish them for it. So those kinds of concerns are present in this data, but they're not explored by our study. In our study, you don't know about the gender of the employer. The employer does not know about your gender. I think there's a bunch of exciting work that could be done on that topic specifically. But in our case, we're not. There's no channel for backlash because, or for differential gender backlash, because the gender of the worker is not known.
Are you also looking at race, ethnicity, and do you have it in the data, or is this a platform which you can ask the same question across other domains?
So we don't look at race or ethnicity. In the paper, there's a bunch of things that we do look at that sort of we ask about. We find that we ask about age, we ask about political affiliation, we ask about education. So I can tell you things like younger people self-promote more than older people, or give higher self-evaluations than older people. More educated people give higher self-evaluations than less educated people. This is all conditional on absolute performance. And people who are more favorable towards Republicans give higher self-evaluations than people who are more favorable towards Democrats. It's not, we can control for those. It's not that we're getting all Republican men and Democrat women, right? So that's not driving the gender gap. But there is evidence of that. The only difference in the gender gap that we observe is actually on that political spectrum. So there's a bigger gender gap among Republicans than there is among Democrats. It's basically Republican men say that they're great, and Republican women do not get the same, sort of increase in self-evaluations from being Republican. So that gender gap increases from Democrats to Republicans. But that's the only sort of other kind of exploration that we've done on this with our demographics.
So a methods question, I'll just ask this generically since I'm not sure, but with MTurk and these tools, obviously attention is a huge issue. And just diligence and caring about answering accurately versus just getting through it and getting your money. Yep. Like suppose for a moment that there was a gender difference on that, which of course that itself is an interesting question why that would be. But if that were the case, I'm having trouble thinking through all your various permutations, but is there?
Yeah, so this is how we deal with it.
Go the other way or?
No, this is a great question. We think about attention for sure. I think one thing is, those who are worried about MTurk, I should say two things. One, all of the MTurk studies were done before the pandemic. So Christine and I, and some of our other work, we have seen differential attention post-March. All of that stuff was done pre-pandemic. The last wave was actually done last week on Prolific, but we replicated everything in one of our prior treatments. And so, so that's kind of reassuring. Even in the pandemic, we're getting the same effects. The thing that I can say about attention, one, I don't know how people who are not paying attention, how that would affect where they put themselves on these scales or whatnot. One kind of measure of attention that we use, and this is detailed in the paper, we can look at people who answer less than five or fewer questions correctly on the 20-question test. Right, 5 questions is what you get, an expectation if you're guessing, if they're all multiple choice questions. So if you eliminate those people, those potentially inattentive people are just clicking through, if anything, our gender gaps get bigger. So it's not the case that our gender gaps are being driven by people who are clicking through as quickly as possible. I think obviously you want to worry about that. I think the data on the youth, that's in a different context. Maybe they're not being attentive. Some of them are doing school from home, like my kids. But it's it's not. We see similar gender gaps there, and the attention issues are going to be different.
I'm coming back just to say, as always, we aim to end on time or like a minute or two beforehand. So I think this is a perfect place to stop. There's so many great questions. Judd, we will get you a copy of all of them because I think, we only got through a small fraction and some of them may guide your future research. Thanks to everybody who came. We hope you really enjoyed the kickoff of this. Dean, thank you for coming and doing an amazing job curating the questions and asking them. We really appreciate that. We're excited to have you as a presenter later in the semester. So if you like Dean's style, you'll get to see it again. If you like Judd's style, join the club. He has an amazing mustache. you won't get to see him again, but you can visit him in other places. Next week, we have Ethan Cross joining us. He's going to be talking about some of his work that's featured in his forthcoming book, actually, Chatter, which I believe goes on sale or is out tomorrow. He's a professor at the University of Michigan of psychology. He's fabulous. It should be another great week, and you'll see where, mixing up the disciplines. So hope to see many of you there. Hope you enjoyed this. And thank you again, Judd and Dean.
Thanks
Bye,
so much.
everybody.